Good evening and welcome to this historic occasion of a combined clinics of Indo-Pak cooperation. Before I start, I'll request Dr. Giriraj Dutt Sharma, the co-founder of Learning General Surgery, to just come and say a few words before we start. Sir.
Hello, good evening, everybody. It's a very pleasant day today that we have a joint meeting. And with this academic meeting, I think all of us are going to be benefited by sharing our experiences, and the residents who present the cases would be benefited. And we hope this meeting is first of its kind, and we have several meetings to follow.
Thank you, sir.
Welcome, all of you.
Thank you, sir. And over to Dr. Shirin. Shirin will be moderating the session, and she's got a galaxy of panelists from Pakistan. And we have two of our panelists, Dr. Pari, who's a hepatopancreabiliary surgeon as well as a liver transplant surgeon from Coimbatore, a town of southern India. And we have Dr. Shankar Subramaniam, another gastrointestinal surgeon from Chennai. Over to Dr. Shirin.
Thank you, sir. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good evening, everyone, as well as Namaste and Assalamu alaikum. I am so much grateful to you, Dr. Radhakrishna, for accepting our request. And I would just like to introduce a panel. First of all, I would like to introduce Dr. Hasnan Zafar, who is the president of Society of Surgeons Pakistan. And he has a special interest in trauma as well as in hernia. And he is also serving in AQ as an associate professor of surgery. Second in the list is Dr. Professor Shahryar Ghaznfar. He is the professor of surgery at Civil Hospital, Karachi. They have a special interest in endoscopies. Till now, I don't know, so far more than thousands of endoscopies we have performed, including ERCPs as well. He also has a special interest in robotic surgery. Till now, he have done approximately about 200 of cases using robots. Then we have in the panel Dr. Fahad Haroon. Dr. Fahad Haroon is the youngest director of Karachi X-Ray, and he is a mentor of Royal College of Radiology. And then in the list, we have Dr. Faisal Siddiqui from LNH. He's an associate professor and head of Department of Unitary Surgery. Then we have Dr. Ghulam Murtaza. He is a general surgeon from Patel Hospital. He is also bariatric and laparoscopic surgeon. And then we have two of our presentator and one from Liaquat National, that is Dr. Maria Haroon. Introducing Dr. Maria Haroon first. She's a registrar of surgery department and is recently appearing in the exit examination of College of Physicians and Surgeons Pakistan. So I would like to give this opportunity to Maria to please present a case on upper GI bleeding. Yes, Maria, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great honor and a privilege to be among so many distinguished faculty. So the case I will be presenting is of a 40-year-old male with no known comorbs. The patient presented to us in the outpatient department and he was admitted electively. He had presented to us with complaints of upper abdominal pain on and off for the past 6 months, and along with black colored stools.
Madhiha, the audio is a little disturbed. If you can do something about it.
Sure, sir, I'll look into it.
Not very clear.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Is it audible?
Yeah, it is.
So I'll repeat. The case that I will be presenting is of a 40-year-old male with no known comorbs. The patient was admitted from the outpatient clinics and he had presented to us with complaints of upper abdominal pain for the past 6 months. And he had also developed black colored stools for the past 4 months. The patient had a positive history the past 3 months. However, he had no significant history for any drug usage. There were no history of any addictions, no surgical history. There was no history suggestive for chronic liver diseases. The weight loss was positive, however, but it was undocumented, and the patient had no any complaints of any dyspeptic symptoms. On examination of the patient, he was a thin, lean, middle-aged male. The patient was alert and oriented and conscious. Clinically, the patient appeared anemic. He was clinically dehydrated. However, there was no edema, no any jaundice, or no any palpable lymphadenopathy. Vitally, he had a blood pressure of around 160 millimeters mercury. He was slightly tachycardic at 109 beats per minute. The patient was AFib. On his abdominal examination, the abdomen was soft, it was non-tender. However, there was an ill-defined mass that was palpable in his right hypochondrium and the epigastrium. On the digital rectal examination, he had a black colored stool staining of the left finger. There was no any jaundice, as I said, there was no ascites or any pulmonary. So I would like the audience, if they've developed a clinical impression based on the information that I've given. Any residents who want to come forward?
Here, I would like to say, if somebody wants to participate, they can raise their hand by clicking the raise hand button, or either they can write a question in the chat box. Any idea what this case is about?
Yeah, Dr. Maria has raised the hand. She can. Maria's here.
Yes.
Hello, greetings to all. Looking at the case and the examination findings, it is pretty clear that it could be because of upper GI bleeding. Considering that the patient had melena and microcytic anemia and anemic findings on the general physical examination, it could very well because of upper GI bleeding. And there are possible causes to that. It could be because of any small bowel malignancy. However, that is pretty rare, but it can happen considering that there is a palpable mass on the abdominal examination as well. Secondly, other causes can be angiodysplasias, as it is the ectatic vessels occur in the small intestine, so that could be a possible cause. Second, other causes can be because of peptic ulcers or in any inflammatory bowel disease that could lead to that.
Okay, my dear, carry on. Dr. Matia.
Coming forward with the investigations, the patient, he had a low HP of 3.1. He had a TLC of around 26,000. On the electrolytes, he had a deranged sodium of 129. Liver functions were also deranged. The patient presented to us with the CEA levels of around 103. The patient, owing to the palpable abdominal mass that was there on examination, we planned for a CT for this patient. So on the CT scan, there was a large heterogenously enhancing mass that was seen involving the second part of the duodenum, causing its distension. The mass was measuring around 8.3 into 13.1 into 15 centimeters. It was seen involving the adjacent part of the liver parenchyma and was extending into the porta hepatis. The gallbladder was not separately visualized. Anteriorly, the mass was seen reaching up to the anterior abdominal wall and appeared inseparable from the overlying skin. However, this finding was not present on the clinical examination. Posteriorly, it was seen displacing and abutting the right kidney. Medially, the mass was inseparable from the head of the pancreas. There was mild dilatation of bilateral intrahepatic ducts and the CBD. Inferiorly, the mass was inseparable from the hepatic flexure of the colon, and there were multiple enhancing perilesional necrotic lymph nodes that were present. The mass is appreciable. It was seen invading into the liver. The gallbladder could not be separately visualized. These are the CT images of that patient.
Can you please get back to the CT scan if you don't mind? Do we have Dr. Fahad Harun here, sir? Do you want to comment something on the CT scan, sir? Dr. Fahad, we can't hear you. Your mic is switched off. It's muted.
Apologies, right? Thank you for having me on board. It's a great privilege to have a panelist and the audience from India and Pakistan. Becomes a great learning experience. Having just two images, difficult to precisely comment on what I'm looking at, but what I can see is that the liver appears to be markedly infiltrated by ill-defined hyperdense lesion. In the center, what we can see is a dilated structure, predominantly showing air density. So that could be the biliary tree with pneumobilia, and we have some hyperdense material there. Can I have the other image, please? Right. I'll try to show my cursor if I may, so I can point out. Unfortunately. Anyway, so you have a large grossly infiltrating mass here in the porta hepatis, which seems to be infiltrating into the pancreas and laterally right side into the liver as well. So I would need further images to precisely characterize what is the origin of the tumor. And I agree that I don't separately see the gallbladder as well. So that's one thing that you could think of, that could be a gallbladder carcinoma infiltrating into the liver and the biliary tree, or it could be arising from the common bile duct or the pancreas as well. So these would be my three differentials.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Moving forward to the endoscopy. The endoscopy showed mild pangastritis with erythema. There was a large, deep ulcerated growth that was seen arising from the first part of the duodenum, and the scope was seen negotiating easily into the second part of the duodenum. Now I would like to discuss the further management and also discuss the GI bleeding. If you could just take both of them simultaneously together. So I added some literature to it. In the United States, the annual incidence of GI bleed is 40 to 150 episodes and 20 to 27 episodes for every 100,000 people for upper GI bleed and lower GI bleed respectively. The overall in-hospital mortality is around 10% after acute upper GI bleeding. I think it's putting a significant burden to the healthcare, needs multidisciplinary approach, and I think early surgical consults are a good and we need to identify the high risk cases as well. If any of the panelists would like to share something, or the residents would like to put forward some points on this.
Dr. Shankar, welcome, sir. I want to ask you something. What are the most commonest cause in terms of epidemiology, the incidence of the most common causes of the upper GI bleeding in India?
Am I audible, madam?
Yes, sir, you are.
Yeah. Good evening to all. Welcome all of you. Now, as far as the cause of upper GI bleed in India is concerned, two most important causes will be peptic ulcer, and second one is varicose bleed. I think, I don't have hard statistics to defend the statement, but the most common cause will be related to ulcer disease, especially with the increased intake of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and closely followed by varicose bleed. That's my answer for your question. And as far as this particular case is concerned, I need a good CT scan to categorize the lesion. And the most probable cause will be, I would put it as a gallbladder malignancy infiltrating the liver into the duodenum. That will be my first differential diagnosis. And the second differential diagnosis will be the other way one, a duodenal tumor infiltrating the gallbladder and liver. So those are all my possibilities in this particular case.
Thank you, sir. Yes, Matthias.
So, talking more about how to approach a GI bleed, I would, if any of the residents would like to point out something, because I think this is something, this is especially for the trainees who are present in this session, because I think they're the ones who go down to the ER and, you know, receiving and resuscitating something. If anyone wants to add something before I go on forward.
Yes, Matthias, I would like to ask Professor Shehryar, as we have him on the board. Sir, like many of the tumors, we cannot go by endoscopy to see them beneath the level of the duodenum. So for other GI tumors, upper GI tumors, like for upper part of the small intestine, I would like to ask you what's the role of the capsule endoscopy in it? And how oftenly or commonly do we do it in Pakistan? And if it is being done where it's more commonly available?
Thank you, Shireen, for the invitation.
Thank you, sir.
This, I agree with the previous commenter who said that this could be a duodenal carcinoma. I would also agree that it could be a duodenal carcinoma, or the other way around, it could be a gallbladder carcinoma. One thing that I want to emphasize that usually these carcinomas don't bleed that much that it causes a problem in the patients usually. And I agree that mostly in our country, also in Pakistan, mostly the non-variceal bleeding is because of the peptic ulcers. And then the second thing, or the parallel thing that goes with it, are the variceal bleeding. Regarding your questions about the capsule endoscopy, we have done capsule endoscopy in Karachi. We use the Olympus system. We have used that, but then we stopped. The diagnosis by a capsule endoscopy is not easy. You see, there are a lot of images that are captured during the endoscopy, and going through all of those images and trying to find out some pathology in those patients. Like we did more than 100 cases, and in only 2 or 3 cases that we were able to find out a definitive pathology. So so it is very difficult to say the role of capsule endoscopy in the upper GI bleeding or in the lower GI bleeding. I think even in the recent protocols, there is no role of capsule endoscopy, according to my knowledge. We have stopped doing capsule endoscopy, and we rely more on endoscopy to find out the cause or the radiological examination.
Thank you so very much, sir.
Can I make some comments, sir?
Sure, Dr. Pari.
Yeah. So, good evening, all. I'm very excited to be part of this association. So, it is a very nice case. A couple of things I'd like to comment. Just like Dr. Shankar had mentioned, in India, you know, the variceal bleeds and peptic ulcers happen to be the more common ones. But just would like to differ from Dr. Shankar that I am more of HPV and transplant surgeon. So I feel that we tend to see more variceal bleeds now as compared to peptic ulcer bleeds 10 years ago. So that is my observation. Maybe I'm wrong. We see more variceal bleeds. And other observation I'd like to make for the postgraduates who are part of this group is that I feel that whenever you have a intermittent GI bleeds, and then you have and especially the long-standing bleeds, I guess the history is for 4 months, and then you have a mass in the right upper quadrant. The first thing which would strike me is GIST, gastrointestinal stromal tumor, because I have a feeling that if it was a gallbladder malignancy, that's not a usual presentation of gallbladder malignancy to present with GI bleeds. Rather, it presents with jaundice and other symptoms. And at 4 months, it's not usual for a gallbladder malignancy of such a big gallbladder malignancy that's palpable to go on and on for 4 months. So that is one of my observations. So I would think in terms of a sort of a GI gastrointestinal stromal tumor arising from some structure in the right upper quadrant. That is one observation I would like to make. And regarding the capsule endoscopy, in this case, capsule endoscopies are typical for obscure GI bleeds. Here we have a palpable mass, so which means that we have something which is very, very easy to pick up. Most likely a CT scan is going to nail the diagnosis. So in such cases, probably the capsule endoscopy role doesn't exist. It's for those cases where you have exhausted everything, all modes of diagnosis, and then still the bleeding is not felt. That's typically for obscure GI bleeds. Here, this is not obscure GI bleed, it's you're going to make the diagnosis. So capsule endoscopy probably does not have a role in such cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pari. Thank you so very much. I further want to add up to Dr. Pari's school of thought that the gallbladder tumor can't be in that because the gallbladder tumor, the patient presentation is typically unbearable pain. So here there is no such history in that as well. That is also one of the points for not putting it in the differential. Yes, Madhya.
Dr. Shireen, if I could ask Dr. Fahad a question, what is the role of angioembolization in such a tumor that is irresectable?
Yes, Dr. Fahad.
Bleeding. So is that a plausible option for us?
Well, again, see, embolizing a tumor, it could be a renal cell carcinoma, just getting off the context of what we're discussing, or a tumor that we have per se, with the hemoglobin is 3.1 if you're seeing correctly. Again, we see all these cases are now discussed in an MDT here or in the UK or in India for that matter. And it's about benefiting the pros versus the cons. So if the patient is losing hemoglobin, is hemodynamically unstable, and if you ask me to go in and see if I can find a bleeder, and if I can temporarily or hopefully permanently embolize it, well, that would do the trick. And we would probably make the patient again hemodynamically stable. But again, having said that, that would not be our mainstay of treatment. That would not be a definitive treatment. That would be just, managing the hemostasis of the patient at that per se. But again, tumor bleeding, we hardly see that in upper GI presenting as this. But again, like the rest of the panelists says, we would be seeing variceal bleed in patients with chronic liver disease or peptic ulcer disease, which is more commonly noted. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Fahad.
Thank you, sir. Discussing the approach of this patient. So approaching the bleed is always an emergent situation. I think first and foremost, we need to categorize the degree of shock that the patient is in and start the resuscitative measures simultaneously while we're assessing the degree of shock that is present in the patient. I think during resuscitation, we have to be very alert to the pitfalls and to the red flags that a patient may show. We need to just a minute. Yes, I'm sure. I think moving forward, the site of the bleeding has to be identified, relating the clinical findings, stratifying the risk in the patient. If anyone of the residents would want to add something pertinent to the I think then moving forward, I think first and foremost, we also need to categorize whether the bleed is an upper.
Dr. Amsa wanted to say something. Amsa?
Yes.
Yeah, unmute and comment, please.
I just wanted to ask.
Amsa, you need to unmute.
Important. So how do we classify it between upper and lower GI bleed? Just on the basis of in the terms of diagnostic modality, do we only use the endoscope? So do we only use the endoscope to diagnose it or label it as an upper GI or lower GI bleed, or can we use any other diagnostic modality in terms to differentiate it between the upper GI and lower GI bleeding?
Anyone to take this question?
So, Shankar, can I answer that question, sir?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, basically, the definition of upper GI bleed is any bleeding that occurs proximal to the ligament of Treacs, which is the duodenojejunal flexure. And anything distal to that is called lower GI bleed. Lower GI bleed can be further classified into small intestinal bleed and colonic bleed. So basically, the upper GI bleed manifests with the melena, whereas a colonic bleed will manifest with the hematochezia usually. And sometimes you can have varying shades of red in the stools. Sometimes it can be a maroon color stools, especially if you have a ileal bleed or a right colon bleed. So that is the definition of upper GI and lower GI and colonic bleed. Yeah.
Just you wanted to know what modalities other than endoscopy?
No, for upper GI bleed, we have to go for an endoscopy where you can go up to the third part of the duodenum and sometimes into the proximal jejunum. And if it is a lower GI bleed, then you'll have to do a colonoscopy. And if upper GI colonoscopy and colonoscopy are both are not picking up any lesions, then comes the entity what Dr. Pari was discussing, which is called as an obscure GI bleed. In an obscure GI bleed, it is bleeding somewhere from the small intestine, or it's bleeding from the pancreas or from the bile duct. So the next investigation of choice will be to go for a contrast CT or a CT angiogram. And then you can go with either a capsule endoscopy or an enteroscopy. So that will be the algorithm to go in an GI bleed.
Dr. Paha, do you want to comment something on it?
Yes, please, I'd like to. This is basically for the postgraduates. See, when you're requesting a patient, like Dr. Shankar rightly said, if we're in no man's land and we need to diagnose what's going on and we request for a CT scan, so what's usually written in the request slip is CT scan of the abdomen with IV and oral contrast. Okay, so IV, yes, definitely should be given, be it an abdominal protocol or a CT angiogram. But again, where it comes in oral contrast, so you have basically positive and negative oral contrast. So positive would be the IV contrast that you're given, which can be given to the patient to swallow, diluted with water. You can give gastrografin. And then you have negative oral contrast, which is water. So when you are asking for us to pick or detect an occult bleed, it should always be water. We must not give oral contrast, because a technician may give oral contrast, and the bleeder basically is actually the density of the contrast which we see within the lumen of the bowel, rising from the bowel wall. And that's how we pick bleeders on our triphasic study. So when you give water, you can easily pick up a bleeder, but if oral contrast has been given, it becomes a nightmare. And then again, there's no point performing a CT. Secondly, we do triphasic CTs, which is arterial phase, followed by a venous phase and a delayed phase. But again, I couldn't really emphasize more on the fact that a plain study must be done. See, when you do a plain study, you can see if there's any calcification, any previous surgery clips, or any, say, a tablet a patient may have taken, which we see within the bowel lumen, which could obscure a bleed. So when you do an arterial phase, if you start a scan with an arterial phase, it really becomes a diagnostic dilemma. Okay, is this really a bleed or not? But when you have a plain scan, you can exactly compare the plain with the arterial, then the venous, and then the delayed. I agree, the radiation dose becomes quite high, but that becomes a very good study, which we can sit on, look in detail with the surgeon and the gastroenterologist, and hopefully the diagnostic accuracy is usually more than 90%. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pahar. Dr. Hasnan Zafar is also on board. So can you please comment on this question? I guess he's not here right at the moment. I guess, Maria, would you please continue?
Moving forward, these are the Rockwell score is a very commonly used score where upper GI bleeding is concerned. So we would moving forward to the common causes of the GI bleed. I've divided this into two. There's upper GI bleed and lower GI bleed. As we were talking about, upper GI bleed is 80% of the time non-variceal bleeding. That includes gastric and duodenal ulcers. There's the gastritis, duodenitis, esophagitis, biliary tears. There are arteriovenous malformations. Tumors are accounting up to only 2% of the upper GI non-variceal bleeding. Then there's portal hypertensive bleeding that has gastroesophageal varices more than 90%. There's hypertensive portal gastropathy and isolated varices. Causes of lower GI bleed are again divided into colonic and small bowel bleeding. Colonic bleeding is accounting for about 95% of the lower GI bleeding, while a small bowel bleeding is accounting of 5%. Now, categorization of the bleeding: is the bleeding overt? Is it obscure bleeding? Is it obscure occult bleeding, obscure overt bleeding, or occult bleeding? These are the commonly used diagnostic modalities. I think we've quite talked about them in detail. If anyone would elaborate something about intraoperative endoscopy, how is that used? Anyone from this esteemed panel?
Madhya, hello everyone. This is Dr. Faisal. It's a pleasure being here. Madhya, I would like to ask you a question. Intraoperative endoscopy is something which we surgeons use as something of a last resort. One of the things we use as a last resort. And it is usually done in cases where there is small bowel bleeding and we are unable to locate the bleeder. So we usually go in with a small bowel and then go both ways and see where the bleeding is from or where we are suspecting it to be from. So this is usually intraoperative endoscopy, which is not very commonly done, but it is one of the last resorts that we have.
Thank you, Dr. Faisal.
Thank you, sir. Moving forward to the management of GI bleeding. So we employ multiple techniques. Usually the endoscopic techniques are used first. There's interventional radiology. That's coming into play. And finally, when we've exhausted the resources, we move on towards surgery. GI bleeding with malignancy can be seen with primary GI tumors. There can be metastatic diseases to the GI tract and locally invasive tumors, as is probably the case with our patient. The histopathology of this patient was reported as infiltrating carcinoma, which the immunohistochemical profile was favoring moderately to poorly differentiated squamous cell carcinoma. The tumor was positive for cytokeratin AE1 and cytokeratin AE3 and 340. Thank you.
What have you done so far in this case, Dr. Madhya?
This patient was, unfortunately, he was belonging to a very low socioeconomic strata of the society. So he's been lost to follow up. But I think since the histopathology, it's a very rare case. So we decided that we wanted to discuss this case. But unfortunately, the patient was lost to follow up.
Okay. There is one question.
Resuscitated and investigated the patient, but unfortunately could not proceed further.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Madhya. We have one question from the participants here. It's from Dr. Fahad Haroon. What is the role of enterocyclosis versus CT enteropathy for the obscure bleeding, sir?
Well, that's a good question. CT enteroclysis obviously has its own fruitful benefits. But when it comes to GI bleed, there unfortunately is no role. For GI bleed, you do a CT abdominal angiogram or a CT abdomen with IV, and like I said, or contrast between water or methylcellulose, triphasic protocol. CT enteroclysis is basically you put in an NJ tube and then you distend the entire small bowel loops with water and methylcellulose, and that basically is not to check bleeders, but that is basically done to look for any bowel abnormalities such as ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, or irritable bowel syndrome. So the pattern or the diagnosis is somewhat different for that. Okay.
Dr. Shirin, with your permission, if I can ask Dr. Pari and Dr. Shankar as to how they would have dealt with this patient in case the patient is, willing for treatment. Can I? Shankar?
Yeah.
Yeah, Pari.
Yes, sir.
Pari, to go first.
Yeah. So good case. As I mentioned, GI bleed with a palpable mass in the right upper quadrant. I think I'm looking at, mentally, I'm looking at some sort of a tumor. And then what sort of a tumor typically presents with GI bleed? It's a GI stromal tumor. This is GIST. That is what my clinical diagnosis is, even before I go in for investigations. And as expected, the CT scan showed a heterogeneous tumor in the right upper quadrant with necrosis. Again, which suggests to me that it could have been a GI stromal tumor. But unfortunately, the CT images were not very clear so as to make a anatomical diagnosis. So the first thing I would do different in this case is I will get a good quality triple phase CCT, contrast index CT. Obviously with like what Dr. Fahad was mentioning, with all the plane and all three the arterial, portal and venous cuts. So in my mind, a good CT scan is going to give all the information regarding the anatomical location of the tumor, about the possible histopathological diagnosis, and whether it is a resectable lesion or not. I guess a good quality CT scan is what is required. And once I have a good quality CT, most of these tumors, although they look big, most of them happen to be resectable. Sometimes they may need a major resection, but many times they happen to be resectable. So without a proper CT, I'm probably not able to proceed further. I'm handicapped without a proper CT. So my answer is a good CT scan, and then obviously assessment of the patient regarding the fitness for surgery, and then depending on what the CT scan throws up, plan the diagnosis and management.
Shankar?
Yes, sir. I also agree with Dr. Pari. I need a good CT scan. And as far as the luminal malignancy presenting as significant bleed, I'll have a very low threshold to go for surgery. Of course, this particular tumor is infiltrating into the liver and all, so I need a good CT scan. So generally, luminal malignancy, even if it's going to be a palliative resection, I'm okay with that. So because the best form of palliation for luminal malignancy is to remove the malignancy. So especially a bleeding tumor, and if it is going to be a resectable one, and however the magnitude of the surgery is, I'll try to plan for that. That's what I want to say.
Professor Shahryar, you want to say something, sir?
Yeah, I just have a comment that since the biopsy came out to be moderately differentiated or a poorly differentiated, squamous cell carcinoma, so the diagnosis probably will then shift to the gallbladder, because in the gallbladder mucosa you can have metaplasia and squamous cell carcinomas. So then you won't be thinking about GIST. You will be thinking more in terms of gallbladder cancer. And since this has invaded into the liver and there are dilatation of the biliary channels and there is involvement of the duodenum as well. So my treatment would be palliative. I would, if I can reach up to the ampulla, since the previous endoscopy showed the duodenum, I would put in a metallic stent in the biliary system. And then if in the later period, if the patient develops duodenal obstruction, we can always put in a metallic stent duodenum. And for the palliation of the gallbladder cancer, I think a referral to an oncologist and probably a palliative chemotherapy could be discussed with the patient. Thank you.
Shirin, back to
Sir,
yeah, Pari, you wanted to counter something?
Yeah, yeah. The previous speaker made a very valid points. Only issue of concern is here the palliation is to stop the bleed, and the chemotherapy is unlikely to address that question. So again, I like to go back to what Dr. Shankar was mentioning, that in this case, the palliation is going to be some sort of resection, even if it means R2, in a palliative non-curative resection. So we are looking at, I guess, in my mind, some sort of a resection to get rid of that bleeding point, if at all possible. So a good CT scan again is going to be very, very vital. Chemotherapy is probably not going to palliate him.
Dr. Shirin, back to you.
Yes, sir. Thank you so very much, sir. I just have a query from one of the postgraduates. They're asking if there are any role of radiotherapy to stop bleeding in these sort of cancers.
Can I take this?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, radiotherapy has absolutely no role in this patient, because radiotherapy takes a long time, and and this is already there is a invasion and fistulization into the bowel. All the more reason why radiotherapy wouldn't be advisable. So radiotherapy in this case probably has no role. It takes time. Radiotherapy doesn't act like an angioembolization where it's going to stop the tumor, the bleeding right away. So radiotherapy doesn't work that way. So, and if there is a fistulization of the tumor into bowel, again, radiotherapy is probably not, it's a relative contraindication. So you don't use radiotherapy in such cases.
Thank you, sir. So there is one more question from the audience, that what are the palliative surgical resection options available for this patient or any other patient who needs just palliation? That in case of the tumor which have already been infiltrated in liver.
Yeah, Bari, again, back to you that, someone wants to know, so what is the surgical palliation you can think of in this patient in case?
Yeah, suppose if it turns out to be a carcinoma gallbladder infiltrating into duodenum, then sometimes you will not be able to offer anything surgically, but if at all that CT scan is more benign, so we may try and do a sort of a extended or even a simple cholecystectomy and take a rim of duodenum, something called a sleeve resection or a wedge resection of the part of duodenum, because I guess the duodenum in part of the duodenum involved is on the lateral wall. So we may still be able to remove the tumor along with the sleeve of duodenum, and then anastomose it to a loop of jejunum to create a duodenojejunal anastomosis. And that may be the answer for this patient who is having a bleed. So here the answer is going to be try and remove the tumor, if possible by a curative surgery, or if not possible, at least by a palliative surgery. Probably surgery is the only thing which is going to stop the tumor in this patient.
Zafar, what is your question? Yeah, please. Yes, Dr. Zafar. What is your comment?
Yes, I would like to kind of second what has been said by Dr. Shehryar. I think this is advanced malignancy in a terminal patient. GI bleeding is just one of the manifestation. He should be provided with palliative care. And in case of catastrophic bleeding, angioembolization is the way to go.
With due respect, if I can comment, I think that is the most valuable statement, that surgery is not at all possible in this patient, because we technically will be doing more damage than good. I don't know whether Pari was still thinking in terms of GS stromal tumor, but this is something else. We really do not know where this squamous cell carcinomas come from. We think it is from gallbladder cancer. Although it's very unlikely for a gallbladder cancer to go this big and bleed. It doesn't bleed. Anyway, so the treatment option should be an embolization in case of a torrential bleed, as Professor was commenting, but that's the only. Someone else has raised a hand, and yeah. Dr. Madiha, you want to say something?
So my question was addressed by Dr. Hasnan.
Okay, and Professor Shahryar again. Yes, sir. Please come in. Professor Shahryar, you want to say something?
Tumor can bleed in two ways. One is by hemophilia. If the tumor is into the system and from the hello.
We can't hear you, sir, properly.
Hello.
Yes. Okay, I think we'll go back to Dr. Shireen. Pari, one last comment to what I said, if you have anything to say.
Absolutely agree with you, sir. Obviously, we don't want to make things worse. That's our first aim. So that's exactly why, again and again, we need to stress that, we need to have a very good quality CT scan, and we need to really have a look at it with an open mind, whether we would be able to do something which would help the patient and not make him more miserable. So absolutely, we have to go with that. But only thing is that big tumors don't necessarily mean they are unresectable. Especially this tumor does not have jaundice. So this patient does not have jaundice. Even if it's a gallbladder malignancy, it could just be a big tumor from the fundus of gallbladder infiltrating into the duodenum, in which case a palliative resection is not impossible. So if the same patient had jaundice, it's a totally a different ball game. But this patient without jaundice, and even if it's a gallbladder tumor, even if it's a big size tumor, you may still have a scope for doing a limited resection.
Actually, big size tumors are not that malignant if you really look into.
Absolutely.
The big voluminous cauliflower-like tumors in gallbladder, they remain there for a long time. Anyway, I think.
Sir, just one point, sir.
Shankar, yes.
As far as this angioembolization for tumor bleeding, I think that's not a panacea. Unlike when you think of in terms of benign conditions, because it's angioembolization is not a good technique to stop bleeding from malignant tumors. That's the point I want to make.
Yeah, back to Dr. Shireen.
Yes, sir. There is a twist in the program. Shall we go for it?
Yes.
So there's a twist. Initially, we were thinking of presenting one case that was on upper GI bleed, but we have a second case as well on the lower GI bleed.
Yes.
I would like to hand over to Dr. Wafa Iftikhar from Al Khan University Hospital. She'll be presenting her case. Yes, Dr. Wafa, over to you, please.
Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Wafa Iftikhar. I'm a resident general surgery at AKU. So I'm here to discuss a case.
Can you have the full screen, please? Full screen.
Wafa, can you go on to full screen?
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
So I'm here to discuss a case. She is a 24 female. She presented to us in ER with a history of fever and abdominal pain for the past 50 days. She was initially treated as outpatient with antibiotics as suspicion of enteric fever. She developed lower GI bleed 5 days back and was managed in a secondary care center with massive blood transfusions for hemorrhagic shock. She also underwent a colonoscopy there, which showed multiple ulceration in small and large bowel loops. She was in ICU over there and did not get better, was worsening in condition, developed hypovolemic shock, and was referred to tertiary care center. She presented to us in ER with hemorrhagic shock and ongoing lower GI bleed. Her hemoglobin on arrival was 3.6, hematocrit of 11, platelet count of 32, and a TLC of 15. She already received approximately 10 pack cells and multiple other blood products. She was initially resuscitated in ER and then was proceeded with CT scan abdomen with IV contrast. I would like to share the CT scan with you all. So here we have her CT scan with us, a CT abdomen and pelvis with IV contrast for that. So her CT scan showed two different findings. And there was the gallbladder seemed to be distended, measuring approximately 88 by 47 mm. There was no evidence of discrete calculus in the gallbladder. However, the gallbladder was thick-walled and there was a hypodense focus that was seen at the superior wall of the body of the gallbladder, measuring approximately 19 by 16 mm. This raised the possibility of acute cholecystitis with gallbladder perforation. However, the other significant finding was the presence of intraluminal contrast. Intraluminal contrast in the distal pelvic iliac loops on arterial phase, which later on, which subsequently increased in volume gradually, as seen in the scan. These contrasts were showed dispersion on the venous phase of the CT scan, and this was suggestive of active GI bleed. I would now like to ask the panel, particularly the residents, what should be the next course of management for this particular patient?
But meantime, can we get Dr. Fahad, the radiologist, in to comment on this strange combination of features? Is there?
Can they put the venous images?
Yeah, the radiologist is there?
Wafa, can you go a little bit slower and ask Dr. Fahad to comment on these images?
I can't see Fahad in the audience. I don't know whether this is there or not.
Unfortunately, Dr. Fahad have left for some time because his mother is admitted and ICU secondary to COVID infection. So,
yeah, Dr. Pari, you can comment.
Can you?
Yeah. Okay. I think the first image showed us arterial phase. Is there a venous phase images that this presenter can show us all? This is a very delayed phase where you can see the contrast in the urinary bladder. So is there a venous phase? Yeah, this is the venous phase. Good. Yeah, keep scrolling. Okay. Yeah, I guess I think we are able to see arterial blush in the arterial phase images in the iliac loops, and that appears to increase within the venous images. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm not really able to appreciate major abnormality in the gallbladder wall, but maybe I am not appreciating that. But right now, that is not my concern or my immediate concern. The immediate concern is the GI bleed, and I guess I know where to look for. And so this patient, after a proper resuscitation, would need to be taken to the OR. And then this is the place where I would use the intraoperative,
Before we come to the
endoscope.
management, Pari,
Okay.
Some of the residents are, the presenter wanted comments from the trainees, if any.
Okay,
Sir, can I give my opinion, sir? Shankar here, sir. This patient is quite young. She's in the 20s. And of course, there is history of some fever and all. So there is a possibility that this could be a typhoid ulcer bleed. Though we see those cases a little rare nowadays. Another possibility that I want to entertain in this particular patient is I will still keep Meckel's diverticular bleed as a possibility, considering the age of the patient. So if I have to rule out a Meckel's diverticular bleed, I will do a technetium pertechnetate scan, which is very specific for Meckel's diverticulum. So before I offer surgery for this patient, I will definitely do a Meckel scan for this patient, considering the age of the patient. That I want to tell here.
Yeah, Professor Shahryar.
I just want to comment that the typhoid ulcer bleed or typhoid ulcer is not that uncommon here in Pakistan. We have multi-drug resistant typhoid nowadays that are resistant to most of the antibiotics. And we see a lot of these patients in our surgical units. This is a young patient. I missed some of the earlier slides. So probably I would be much prone towards going towards the interventional radiology and try to stop the bleeder through angioembolization. That would be my comment.
Professor Hasnain, sir, would you like to comment anything on it?
No, Dr. Shiri, I would kind of also tend to agree with Dr. Shahryar in terms of interventional radiology, because we tend to do a lot, at least here, if the facilities are available. There is always a small risk of delayed perforation, but that's a small risk. And it is much less invasive on these sick patients to go for interventional radiology, obviously, if it is available, and treat for typhoid, irrespective.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Siri, if I can comment here.
Yes, sir, sure.
Yeah, actually, this is a young patient with a very low hemoglobin and a very active arterial bleed. I agree with Dr. Shankar when he is thinking in terms of a possible Meckel's diverticulum, because that the bleed seems to be considerable and also had a considerable bleed to have a hemoglobin of 3. So if it's a Meckel's, well, we need to go in and operate. And I really do not know whether interventional radiology can help in bleeding typhoid ulcers. As you see, a typhoid ulcer itself would have eroded considerably, because this bleed will occur in typhoid ulcers just before perforation. So I may tend to disagree in terms of interventional radiology in this patient. Having said that, I also want Professor Shahriyar's comment on the gallbladder pathology, whether there is any gallbladder pathology or a perforated gallbladder, what Dr. Wafa is commenting on. I want both the senior professors from Pakistan to comment.
I would agree with Dr. Pari, and I honestly don't see anything wrong with the gallbladder. But it is up to the radiologist to define the wall. I don't see any pericholecystic fluid around the gallbladder. So to me, gallbladder appears to be normal, unless this is stated otherwise by the radiologist.
Can I make a comment, sir?
I would also kind of go with the old, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, Rupali, yes.
Yeah, sorry if I interrupted somebody. I just wanted to, I thought of putting the colonoscopic images. I guess the colonoscopy showed some colonic ulcers as well as ileal ulcers. So I was thinking how we could put these two together along with bleeding from the small intestine. Typically, typhoid ulcers are not present in the colon. So that goes against typhoid. But we do have other causes of enterocolitis like Campylobacter jejuni and E. coli, various types of E. coli, which can cause ulcers in both small bowel as well as jejunum. So for me, it looks like some sort of a tropical disease which has caused ulcers in both the ileum and colon, and one of the ulcers is bleeding. So that is the type of differential that I'm having, typhoid being one and other being other tropical illnesses like Campylobacter jejuni. So in my mind, this requires surgical exploration, because typically the bleeding from the small bowel is more difficult to manage with angioembolization, and there is a significant chance of perforation or gangrene, as already mentioned. So putting all these things together and it being not a major surgery, I would rather go in for a surgery right away.
There's a question in the chat box. Can this be IBD? If anyone can take that question up. Yeah, Shankar.
Actually, IBD can produce a massive lower GI bleed, but the clinical presentation of the patient doesn't look like that. So the clinical presentation looks something like an infective pathology, something like a necrotizing enteritis or colitis. But inflammatory bowel disease is known to produce, especially fulminant type of thing can produce a massive bleed. And as far as this particular case is concerned, I agree with our Pakistani colleagues that having identified a bleeder on a CT angiogram and considering the age of the patient, and if I have ruled out a Meckel's diverticulum, my first preferred choice will be to go for an angioembolization. But I need a good intervention radiologist who can go and do a super selective embolization of the vasa recti, the terminal branches, because we always run the risk of developing a intestinal ischemia and necrosis of the bowel. So the first option for me will be to go for an angioembolization and try that. And if I can control the situation with that, I'm fine. But on the other hand, I'll always have to monitor this patient for a development of intestinal necrosis after embolization. That problem is there. It has to be a super selective embolization of the bleeding vessel.
Yeah, back to you, Dr. Wafa.
So as agreed by most of the panelists here, we proceeded with angioembolization. I would like to share the angioembolization videos with you.
So there is a question like, can it be IBD? Dr. Sheriar wanted to comment on it.
Yes, sir.
Okay, Dr. Sheriar, sir.
Oh, I think this has already been commented that there was no history, no clinical history that corroborates with the inflammatory bowel disease. And the other thing was that the colonoscopy did not show a typical characteristic of inflammatory bowel disease. But yes, I agree that inflammatory bowel disease can present with massive bleeding, and it can involve the whole of the colon and the terminal ileum as well.
Thank you, sir.
So just waiting for the images to load.
That is very high tech, Dr. Wafa. You're straight from the monitor.
So these are the angioembolization clips that I'm sharing with you guys. So here, right here, we find active contrast blush in the areal lobes. I hope everyone can appreciate these things.
Yes, we can appreciate it, Wafa. This was the time when patient was actively
Yes, sir.
bleeding. And what were the hemodynamic parameters?
Yes, sir. She was actively bleeding, but she was resuscitated in the ER and then was shifted to the radiology unit. She had episodes, multiple episodes, with gaps of approximately half hour to 1 hour, in which she had profuse lower GI bleed. So while she was stabilized in ER, and we found a window of moving her to radiology, we shifted her to radiology and got her angioembolized. So here we see the SMA was cannulated using a 2.7 French microcatheter, and a distal branch of the iliocolic artery was selectively cannulated. I can show you. Just a second. So here, this is it. Here we can appreciate that the coiling was done, and we see that there is no active contrast blush in these scans.
Dr. Wafa?
Yes.
Can you please put your cursor on it for the audience?
This is a 2.2 by 2 mm coil that was placed in one of the branches of the iliocolic artery. Beyond the coil, we see that there is no active contrast blush here, compared to what we saw previously.
So Wafa, what kind of embolization was done? Which coil was used?
Sir, as far as I know, 0.018 compatible 2 by 2 mm coil was used.
So,
I'm not
so based on our Indian professor's point of view, was this super selective?
Yes, sir, it was super selective. Distal branches of the iliocolic artery was actually selectively cannulated.
Yeah, great work indeed. But Wafa, are you a radiology postgraduate or a surgery postgraduate?
Sir, I'm a surgery postgraduate.
Yeah, well done.
So
Yeah,
do we have any comments on these?
I want Pari and Shankar to comment on this.
Yeah, very nicely done embolization, but whether it is super selective, I'm not the right person to answer that. But in my mind, as we go towards the terminal ileum, the number of arcades keeps increasing. Jejunum has much lesser arcades than the terminal ileum. So as far as I know, there are at least 2 to 3 arcades between the major artery and the bowel lumen. So my guess is that it could have been even more super selective. They could have gone even closer to the bowel wall. So it is fairly well done. I mean, it's a fantastically done procedure. But whether it could have been a little more super selective, my guess is yes, it could have been even closer to the bowel lumen.
Shankar?
Yes, sir. We'll have to. It's a wonderful job that has been executed. So definitely, angioembolization is possible in these kinds of bleeds, and it needs a good radiologist who can go to the distal most branch and embolize, so that we don't end up in a bowel necrosis. Having said that, there are a couple of occasions where we have had situations where embolization has been done, and then the patient develops necrosis, and we have to re-explore. So we cannot ignore that particular. This patient needs monitoring the post-operative period meticulously, and sometimes there is something called post-embolization syndrome, where the patients will have some kind of severe pain and tachycardia and leukocytosis, but actually they will not have intestinal necrosis. So we have to be aware of an entity called post-embolization syndrome, which warrants a repeat CT scan to make sure that the bowel is viable. Yeah, those are all the points I want to make.
Yeah, my only worry, Dr. Shankar, is this is a beautifully done procedure, very well sort of imaged and all that. But since small bowel vessels or end arteries, isn't that when you have two coils like that, one triangular area of ischemia of the small bowel?
Yeah, that's why they have to wedge the catheter as distally as possible. So then only we don't run the risk of producing ischemia to the bowel. But at the same time, we have to arrest the bleeding. So you need a good radiologist who can wedge their catheter as distally as possible and do a good job. Yeah.
So in at least in Pakistan, we have accumulated reasonable experience of doing this. Initially, we were worried also, but the incidence of bowel ischemia is less than what we thought. And at some point in time, I think what we can do is we can go back and look at the number of cases and present a series of what happened. I mean, it is true, a perforation can happen, and sometimes perforation can happen as late as 2 weeks or 3 weeks, 2 weeks down the line. So, but it's still a good modality. Obviously, the professor has rightly pointed out that post-operative, very close observation is required. Wafa, over to you.
Sir, there is a question from the audience. Dr. Matia Harun have asked that what is the optimal time to go and get CT scan done after embolization?
Dr. Madhya, I would like to answer that question. So in our center, what we do is we start off with resuscitation of the patient. We always try to find out a particular window in which the patient is stabilized, and we think that the patient can be moved to radiology. Procedures like these almost take approximately 1 to 2 to 3 hours, approximately 1.5 to 2 hours. So we need to make sure that we have a patient who is stable enough to be in radiology. Also, we make sure that we have a resident who has ACLS paid and can manage emergency situations in radiology.
And what about the post-embolization?
Dr. Wafa, I was inquiring about how our Indian faculty said post-embolization. So that was my question.
How did you monitor this patient? Yeah.
So what we do is normally, since being in a country which is resource limited, we don't always go towards re-scanning patients after embolization. We monitor them closely, clinically. Particularly follow up with HB, which is done every 6 hourly and sometimes even 4 hourly, and checking on their vitals and presence of any abdominal sign. If we think that there is a red flag, we then move the patient towards CT scan. Otherwise, we don't. I would like to proceed. I would just we can actually, but I would like to proceed with the further course of this.
Dr. Wafa, I would like to interrupt. Sorry, there is an answer from Dr. Shahryar. He said that we can get the CT scan done post-embolization depending upon the clinical condition, as already Wafa mentioned, and doing certain tests like CPR and lactate levels in the patient.
I totally agree with him.
Okay, yes, Wafa, continue there.
So this patient presented to us with an HB of 3.6 and a TLC of 15.7. So like I already discussed, we were expecting an infective etiology in the patient. She was monitored with repeat HB SCT, which showed increasing thread of 5.7 and a 9.9. She was then shifted to our ICU unit. Her TSC count was also monitored and she was started on broad spectrum antibiotics. So she did have further episodes. She did have.
Please carry on. Yes.
She did have further episodes of lower GI bleed, but they were small in amount and they mostly contained old clotted blood. Over the time for the entire resuscitation, she received 5 vaccines, 6 placements, and 6 FFPs. Antibiotics broad spectrum was started, and she was shifted to our ICU unit. So I would like to show you the trend of the hemoglobin that we did. So she was, when she was shifted to ICU, she was shifted on an HB of approximately 9.8, which was then maintained throughout her stay in our hospital setup. Her post-procedure stay was approximately 8 days, which means she stayed with us for total 8 days, on which we monitored her with repeat HbSP, which was pretty much static. Her TSC count also came back to normal. Before her discharge, since she had on and off episodes of lower GI bleed, particularly old clotted blood, before her discharge, we did do a colonoscopy on her. Her colonoscopy findings showed transversely located scattered ulcers in different stages of healing in the transverse colon, descending colon, and the terminal ileum. Her histopathology was reported to be fragments of small bowel mucosa exhibiting moderate non-specific inflammation with ulcers, rough, and granulation tissue formation. So we concluded that she presented to us in a state of colitis, which was treated with antibiotics and an emergency angioembolization. She followed with us in the clinic approximately 10 days after her discharge and was doing well with no further episodes of lower GI bleed. That's all from my side.
Wonderful case and very well presented. Congratulations, Dr. Wafa. Yeah,
thank you so much. No, we never did her CT scan again because she's remained clinically and vitally stable.
Well, Dr. Sherin, back to you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, if anybody wanted to conclude from your side.
Yeah, but Bari and Shankar for your comments.
Yeah, fantastic. Good case and fantastic presentation. Very confident presentation by Dr. Wafa. We all enjoyed it. So my thoughts is that we failed to nail the diagnosis. That is one thing. So most of these cases happen to be some sort of a trophical bowel infection. And I was wondering whether blood culture was taken before the antibiotics were started. Sometimes you may get a clue, Salmonella typhi or Campylobacter, E. coli, all these things could be, isolated from the blood culture. I was just wondering whether any blood culture was taken and whether it was positive. I presume it wasn't. There wasn't any growth in the blood culture. So
yes. Yes, sir, we did do her blood cultures. Unfortunately, she presented to us after her 5-day stay at another hospital and has received multiple antibiotics. Her blood cultures were negative with us.
Right. So then we presume that it was some sort of a regular run-of-the-mill GI infections, some sort of enterocolitis, which has got handled very well and is unlikely to recur. Because the small bowel is also extensively involved, I presume it's not amoebiasis, which is the other thing which we have to keep in mind. So because if it was a predominantly colonic involvement, I would have followed up with metronidazole, anti-amoebicidal treatment for 14 days at least. Because it was a predominantly small bowel involvement, I guess metronidazole is not very important. But I'd like to hear from Dr. Patta and Dr. Shankar whether would you think of amoebiasis? Would you like to do a anti-amoebicidal treatment for this patient?
Shankar, then
Yeah.
I'll speak.
Sir, I mean, if it's purely colonic involvement, definitely amoebiasis has to be kept in mind. But because it's a small bowel is also involved, little less likely. That's a point I want to make. The second point I want to make is it was a very good presentation. I just want to congratulate the presenter. And two more points which has already been put in the chat box. I want to reinforce that. In case when you are following up these patients, two investigations which are very useful is apart from the hemoglobin and CBC and total count, you can go for CRP levels and lactate levels to suspect any intestinal necrosis, which has been already mentioned in the chat box by one of the faculty. I just want to reinforce that point. And doing a CT scan post-procedure is based on clinical judgment of the treating doctor. And in this particular case, I was a little worried about doing a colonoscopy within 7 days after doing an embolization, which was actually not warranted. As the patient was getting stabilized and improving, that could have been kept for a later date, if at all it is needed. So those are all the points and the concluding remarks I want to make.
Yeah, regarding Paris question, see, we have had a publication from Delhi unit where we've seen that the commonest cause of lower GI bleed is non-specific ileal ulcers. Actually, when patients have non-specific ileal ulcers, perhaps it didn't prove anything. Actually, a similar study was there from Chennai as well. They don't have colonic ulcers in association. I mean, that's very, very unusual to have ulcers in both places. And amoebiasis, again, it's more of a cecal and ascending colon and sigmoid colon rather than small bowel. But then, of course, since anti-amoebic treatment doesn't cause anything or has no any adverse effects, I would rather go ahead and do it. But otherwise, this must be one of those non-specific ileal ulcers which were bleeding, is what my feeling. Because, and again, what used to be followed in earlier days is when you have no other sort of, we are not able to control non-surgically, then you used to go and do a blind right hemicolectomy where about 95% of the patients used to become all right. So this just to say that the majority of the lower GI bleeds will come from distal ileum and proximal colon, where the right hemicolectomy will encompass the whole area. For in situations where we do not have a very good, say, interventional radiology or colonoscopy facilities, right hemicolectomy can be very life-saving, especially this lower GI bleeding, massive lower GI bleeding occurs only in this age group, second, third decade. And again, Dr. Shirin, it's a very, very interesting, very pleasurable and pleasant initiative, I should say. Then I really myself enjoyed listening to both the presenters and the faculty, and I'm sure you have enjoyed it too. Dr. Shirin.
Thank you so very much, sir. Yes, somebody wants to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of more things for the postgraduate benefit. The other few things that is not very well emphasized, but people need to know is that NSAIDs. So NSAIDs are one of the important causes of non-specific small bowel ulcers, typically terminal ulcers. So a history of NSAID intake for whatever reason in patients may be helpful in many cases, but they don't present with colonic ulcers. They are more of a small bowel ulcers. So that is one thing which we need to keep in mind. And predominantly colonic lesions like this, without small bowel lesions, people have to think of clostridial ulcers. Then again, the history of antibiotics is there, and even a single shot of antibiotic or a single dose of antibiotic can, predispose to Clostridium difficile, C. diff ulcers, and they can present with major bleeding. So, but here, because there was ulcers in the small bowel also, we didn't talk about that. But for the sake of postgraduates, I think they need to keep in mind these two lesser discussed entities, NSAID ulcers and Clostridium difficile ulcers.
Thank you, Dr. Pari. Thank you so very much, sir. Anybody from the panel of Pakistan would like to conclude about the session? Any concluding remarks?
Yes, I would like to comment, please.
Yes, Dr. Petrel.
Yes, I think it was a very, very educating and a very pleasurable experience to, having this discussion between all of us. And as a takeaway message from this second case that we did of lower GI bleed, I think what the postgraduates need to understand is that it has to be a cool-headed approach to these kind of problems. You have to keep surgery as a backup measure if the other modalities fail. The angiographic embolization is should be the first line for treatment of these kind of pathologies, with obvious caution, of course, because there is always a risk of necrosis, bowel necrosis, and with due diligence, it is possible to get away without surgery in such patients. So surgery is obviously one of our most strong fortes that we have, but as one of my seniors used to say, that it is important to know how to operate, but it is more important to know when not.
Very well elucidated, Dr. Petrel. Dr. Shahryar, Dr. Shahryar Gazanfar, Dr. Hasnan Zafar, sir, do you want to say anything?
Shireen, I would like to congratulate you and rest of the presenters on this excellent initiative. I would like to welcome our friends from across the border. We should have more of these sessions. It was a pleasurable learning session. And most importantly, this session was dominated by lady surgeons. So there's a very positive gender balance here. So thank you very much. Looking forward to further sessions in future.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much. Yes, Dr. Shahryar, do you want to conclude? Do you want to say something?
I just would like to second Dr. Hasnan, congratulate you and the presenters who have presented wonderfully, and we had a good discussions, and hopefully it was some good points for the postgraduates as well who are listening or who are joining with us today. And hopefully we will be doing that more often with our colleagues in India as well.
Inshallah. Thank you, sir.
Shireen, I'll be glad if we can do every Friday a presentation like this, if you have the time and the inclination.
Inshallah, sir. I will definitely. I will get in contact with you again, and we'll add up more people to this joint venture team. Yeah. And inshallah, we'll do it. Thank you so very much, Dr. Radhakrishna, for accepting my request. And I have been in indirect or direct way a student of yours, student of Dr. Pari, student of Dr. Shankar, as I was daily watching your online Facebook programs and all that. And I have learned a lot, because learning is a process that never stops. Even you become a consultant, it does not mean it's a full stop to learning. So thank you so very much for your kind concern. Inshallah, we'll be looking forward for more such programs in the future. And thank you so very much for accepting this request. And in the end, I would like to thank Dr. Wafa for in the last moment, she accepted the request. And Dr. Hasnan Zafar, he said that there can be a little bit twist in the program by presenting a case on the lower GI bleed as well. And thank you so very much to all the panelists for coming here. Thank you.
Thanks once again.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I shall conclude here. We shall meet soon again, the same platform. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shireen. Extra thanks to you.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.